Hi guys, this is week 3 of the beginner sequence 1 through 12 lessons. So this is going to be lesson number 3. We always review the previous. So in lessons 1 and 2 we talked about finding your stance, shoulder width apart, stepping out, starting in the balance stance. We talked about the gather step, the passing step, the offline step. We talked about the 4 guards, and we talked about half cutting and the straight parry. In lesson 2 we added 2 more guards, so we now have a 6 guard flow, and we talked about the Unterhaus, the rising cuts. Lesson 3, we introduce full cuts. So like I said last week, I teach half cuts first to try to get students into the habit of cutting out rather than cutting down. It's a pretty common problem that I see, so I started teaching the half cuts first, just because I wanted to make sure that people are cutting, out to long point rather than cutting down. But we do need to know how to do full cuts as well. The big difference is that we are going to let our cut go down into kind of a third position. So if we think about our Oberhaus, we're going to start in Vom Tag, we're going to get the sword motion first, we're going to step through the long point, but rather than stopping the cut here, we're going to let it keep going. And there's kind of a natural stopping point where your body doesn't want to do it anymore. You have a couple of choices. You can ground the sword, or you can kind of try and scrunch up. But what we want to do is at that natural stopping point, we're just going to let it turn over. And that kind of puts you into the changing guard. So if I'm doing this sideways, I'm up in Vom Tag, I'm going to cut through long point, and then at this kind of natural point when my elbows come into my body, I'm going to let the sword turn over, and now my long edge is towards the ground. So, and that will actually let us cut along that same line. So if we practice this in isolation, it's going to look like this. We're in Vom Tag, we're going to step through long point, full cut, to the changing guard, and then we're going to pull Unterhau up to the unicorn, and then back to Vom Tag. And we're just going to cut through, and then through, and through, and then through. And then we would turn around, but of course we can do it backwards as well. So through, reset, through, with the step, reset, and through, and reset. And now we're going to practice it on the other side. So I'm going to put my left foot in the back now. I'm still in my Vom Tag. I'm going to step through long point, kind of hit that same natural stopping point where my elbows come into my body, let the sword flop over, and now my long edge is down. I'm going to pull up to unicorn and back, step and cut through long point to the kind of natural changing position, up and back, through long point, up and back. So, full cuts. The nice thing about this is that this leads us very nicely into the first 4-cut sequence of the Meyer 4 opening drill, or the Meyer square. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with our right foot back, Vom Tag. We are going to step and cut through our long point to this lower position, and we're going to cut along the same line, just like we were doing when we were practicing just cuts 1 and 2. So we're going to come up to cut 2 from unicorn. Now, like when we talked about last week about the knuckles going to the thigh, we're going to bring the knuckles to our right thigh. We're going to pull up the unicorn. We're going to turn over. So rather than when we were here and we were flopping over this way, now that we're here, we're going to flop over this way. So we're going to turn it back so we can cut through that guard. And that is your first 4 cuts. So essentially, upper right, lower left, lower right, upper left. We can let this roll right back up to Vom Tag. And that is the first 4 cuts of the Meyer 4 opening drill. So we're doing this with the full cuts. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's where lesson 3 stops. We just work on the first 4 cuts of the Meyer 4 opening sequence. We talk about how you can do this all to just a long point with the half cuts, but I think teaching it with the full cuts is a nice, easy way to learn, and it gets the pattern in right away. The only other thing we introduce in lesson 3 that we haven't talked about in lessons 1 and 2 is the idea of cutting to defense. So we have spent lessons 1 and 2 parrying. So we've been in our straight parrying position. We've been working on turning the point and the long edge into the cuts. and that is a good way to defend, but we also want to be able to cut into defense. And so the way we talk about it is we always say parry to structure, cut to structure, thrust to structure. So when we are cutting the Zornhau to defend against an Oberhau, we want to make sure that we are cutting a fairly steep line. I think it's easier to learn this from the answer the telephone Bombtag rather than the overhead, so I usually teach it from here. You can, of course, countercut from above, but it just seems to be easier for beginning students to practice doing it from the answer the telephone position. And we do this without a step to start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot, I'm going to project my sword out across the line. My hands are a little bit across the center line. My point is more or less on the line. So I'm going to cut and make sure that I'm pivoting the back foot so that I'm cutting out to a good structure. I want to make sure that I'm closing the line. Might even hit my opponent at the same time, depending on how they're cutting in. The most important thing is that I cut out to good structure so that my edge is still kind of coming into their sword and it's deflecting their cut and I'm having good structure. If I just whack across at their sword, I might stop the cut, but it's also really big and telegraphed. I'm not threatening my opponent, so it's very easy for them to cut around and hit to the side. So I want to make sure that I'm still cutting towards my opponent, but I'm doing so in a way that closes the line. So we just start with the answer the telephone and pivoting and cutting out so that we have good structure, and we'll just practice this motion for a bunch of times. Depending on how that's going, we might talk about doing it with a step back, but I usually save that for a little bit later in the sequence. So just to review for lesson number 3 is review of lessons 1 and 2. We introduce full cuts, including the first 4 cuts of the Meyer square, and then we talk about defense with an Oberhau, Zornhau defense rather than a parry defense, and that's really about it. I think the pace of introductions gets a little slower as we go through the sequence because the kind of basis of knowledge this new student is working on is starting to really grow, and we don't want to throw